The call for help. It was an unusually quiet evening at the Granville police station, the kind of night where time seemed to stretch as officers waited for their shifts to end. Officer Michael Davis, a seasoned policeman with over 15 years of service, sat back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. His partner, Officer Brian Cole, was seated across from him, typing up a report about a minor theft that had occurred earlier in the day. Michael glanced at the clock on the wall. Only 15 minutes to go until the end of their shift. Almost there. Just a few more minutes, Michael muttered to himself, picturing his family waiting for him at home. The thought of his wife, his daughter's laughter, and perhaps even a late dinner on the couch brought a hint of a smile to his face. Brian looked up, sensing his partner's fatigue. Ready to get out of here, huh? Just a little longer, and we're home free. Before Michael could respond, the station phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the quiet room. Both officers froze, knowing that calls at this hour were rarely routine. It usually meant trouble, something serious that could delay them for hours or even disrupt their night entirely. Brian reached over to pick up the phone, pressing the speaker button so Michael could listen in. Granville Police Department, Officer Cole speaking. How can we assist you? He said, his tone professional and calm, expecting a noise complaint or perhaps a report of suspicious activity. Instead, what they heard sent a chill down their spines. A soft, trembling voice, barely more than a whisper, came through the line. Please help me. The voice sounded young, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Brian and Michael exchanged a glance. It sounded like a child, a boy, frightened and alone. Hey there, buddy, Brian said gently, his tone softening as he tried to keep the boy calm. We're here to help you. Can you tell us your name? A long, shaky pause followed, and then the boy's voice returned, small and fragile. My name is Tommy. Okay, Tommy, Michael said, leaning forward, his exhaustion forgotten as adrenaline began to course through his veins. Can you tell us where you are? Tommy's voice was so faint that they had to strain to hear him. I'm at home, but you have to hurry. He's going to come back soon. The officers exchanged another look, this one filled with a growing sense of urgency. Who, Tommy? Michael asked, trying to keep his voice calm and soothing. Who's going to come back? My dad, the boy replied, his voice quivering. He hurts me. I don't know what to do. Please help me. Then, just like that, the line went dead. Brian tried calling back, his fingers moving quickly over the keypad, but there was no answer. They both knew what that meant. This was no ordinary call. Michael shot up from his chair, his mind racing. We have to move, now, he said, grabbing his jacket and the keys to the patrol car. His heart was pounding. He'd taken countless calls over the years, but something about this one felt different, more urgent. Brian was already on his feet, grabbing his own jacket, the gravity of the situation evident on his face. Did we get an address? Yes, Michael replied, his voice tight. The boy gave us his location before the line cut out. Let's go. The two officers rushed out of the station, their boots pounding against the cold floor. As they got into the patrol car, the quiet of the evening now felt ominous, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Michael drove with a sense of urgency, pushing the car faster than usual, his mind locked on the image of a young boy waiting in fear. The drive was tense, with both officers lost in their own thoughts, each haunted by the desperate voice of the child on the other end of the line. They knew time was of the essence. Every second counted. What kind of man does this to his own kid? Brian muttered, staring out the window as the darkened streets flew by. The anger in his voice was palpable. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set. I don't know, but we're going to make sure he never gets the chance to hurt that boy again. They turned onto a narrow, dimly lit street, the houses lined with broken fences and unkempt lawns. The neighborhood looked worn and neglected, a place where poverty had taken root and left its mark on every cracked window and faded door. It was the kind of area where dreams faded, and despair often went unnoticed. They pulled up in front of the address Tommy had given them. The house stood at the end of the street, dark and foreboding, with shattered windows and a sagging front porch. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the paint was peeling from the walls, revealing bare, weathered wood beneath. Michael turned off the engine, and the two officers stepped out of the car, each of them moving cautiously. Instinctively, their hands moved toward their holsters as they approached the house. A sense of foreboding washed over them, a silent warning that something terrible lay within. Michael stopped at the base of the steps and turned to Brian. "Stay sharp," he said, his voice low. "We don't know what we're walking into." Brian nodded, his own hand hovering near his gun. "Got it." They moved up the steps slowly, each creak of the wood beneath their boots echoing in the stillness of the night. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze, and as Michael pushed it open, a wave of stale, foul-smelling air hit them. The smell was thick and heavy, a mixture of mold, garbage, and something else, something rotten that set their nerves on edge. The living room was in complete disarray. Trash was scattered everywhere, and the furniture was broken and covered in grime. Empty bottles littered the floor, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips, revealing dark patches of mold. The house felt more like an abandoned ruin than a home, yet somewhere within these walls, a young boy was waiting. "Tommy," Michael called out, his voice carrying through the silence. There was no answer, only the eerie stillness that seemed to hang over the place like a shroud. The officers exchanged a look and stepped further inside, their eyes scanning every corner of the darkened room. The floor creaked under their weight as they moved cautiously through the house, each step revealing more neglect, more signs of despair. They reached the staircase leading to the second floor, and Michael motioned for Brian to follow him up. The stairs were steep and rickety, groaning under the pressure of their boots. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched before them, dark and silent. Each door they passed hung open, except for one at the very end. It was closed, and unlike the rest of the house, it looked strangely clean and well kept. Michael approached the door cautiously, every instinct on high alert. "Tommy," he called out, his voice barely a whisper. A faint response came from the other side, trembling and weak. "I'm here." Michael tried the doorknob, but it was locked. He looked at Brian, who gave him a nod, understanding what needed to be done. With a single forceful kick, Michael broke down the door, and it swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. What they saw inside made their blood run cold. In the corner of the room, huddled on the floor, was Tommy, a boy no older than 7, his small frame trembling with fear. His clothes were torn and filthy, his face streaked with tears, and his eyes wide with terror. But the most horrifying sight was the heavy chain around his ankle, binding him to the bed like a prisoner. Michael's heart clenched at the sight. He had seen many things in his years on the force, but nothing could have prepared him for this. Kneeling beside the boy, he tried to keep his voice steady, hiding the horror that churned within him. "It's okay, Tommy," he said softly, reaching out a hand. "We're here now. You're safe." Tommy looked up at him, his eyes brimming with tears. He's coming back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's going to hurt me again." Michael exchanged a grim look with Brian. They weren't just here to rescue a frightened child. They were racing against time. Shadows of fear. The room was silent, a thick and oppressive quiet broken only by the shallow, rapid breathing of young Tommy. Officer Michael Davis crouched beside the boy, his heart aching at the sight before him. The child's ankle was bound with a thick, rusted chain, its links heavy and corroded, but still strong enough to keep him tethered to the bed. Tommy's pale skin bore bruises and scratches, his clothes were torn and filthy, and his wide, frightened eyes darted from Michael to the door, as though expecting his tormentor to burst through at any moment. Michael placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder, his voice soft and steady. "Tommy, it's okay. We're here now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." But even as he spoke, he felt the urgency of the situation pressing down on him like a weight. They were in a race against time, and he had no idea how much of it they had left. Brian, who had been standing guard by the door, took in the scene with a look of horror and disbelief. Though he was new to the force, he'd heard of child abuse cases, of course. Every officer had. But seeing it up close, seeing a young boy shackled and trembling, was something else entirely. His hands clenched into fists as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. "My God," Brian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "How could someone do this to their own child?" Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. The question echoed in his mind, gnawing at his resolve. As a father himself, he couldn't fathom the cruelty that must reside in a person to treat their own flesh and blood like this. The anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, but he forced it down. Tommy needed him to be calm, to be in control. "Tommy," Michael said gently, making sure his voice didn't betray the fury he felt. "We're going to get you out of here, okay? You're safe now. But I need you to tell me something. Is your dad here? Is he still in the house?" The boy's small body trembled at the mention of his father, and he shrank back as if the very word could summon the man. His eyes flicked toward the door, wide with terror. He shook his head quickly, his voice barely more than a whisper. He left a little while ago. But he always comes back. He always comes back." Michael exchanged a glance with Brian, the urgency intensifying. They didn't know how much time they had, but they had to act fast. "Brian," Michael said, his voice low but firm, "we need to get this chain off him. Check the patrol car for bolt cutters. We might have a pair in the trunk." Brian nodded, snapping into action as he hurried out of the room. Michael turned his attention back to Tommy, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Tommy," Michael said softly, reaching out to gently touch the boy's shoulder. "We're going to get you out of here. I promise. No one's going to hurt you anymore." The boy looked up at him, tears brimming in his eyes. His lips trembled as he spoke, his voice so faint it was almost lost in the stillness of the room. Are you really going to take me away?" Michael smiled, though the sadness in his eyes betrayed him. "Yes, Tommy. We're taking you somewhere safe, somewhere where no one can hurt you." Tommy's face crumpled, a look of relief and exhaustion washing over him. He seemed to sag, as though the weight of his fear was finally being lifted. Michael stayed crouched beside him, his heart breaking as he looked at the child's thin frame, his bruised skin, and his tear-streaked face. The silence was interrupted by the sound of Brian's hurried footsteps as he returned, bolt cutters in hand. "Found them," he said, slightly breathless, and moved quickly to the boy's ankle. The chain was thick and rusted, but after a few attempts, Brian managed to snap it. The moment the chain fell away, Tommy flinched, instinctively pulling his leg up to his chest, as if he couldn't quite believe he was finally free. Michael kept his hand on the boy's shoulder, offering him a reassuring smile. "You did great, Tommy," he said softly. "Now we're going to get you out of here, okay?" Tommy nodded, but his gaze flickered nervously toward the door again. His small voice trembled as he whispered, He always comes back. He's going to be so mad." A chill ran down Michael's spine at the boy's words. The fear in Tommy's voice was a testament to the trauma he'd endured. "How long has this been going on, Tommy?" he asked gently. The boy hesitated, his fingers clutching the torn fabric of his shirt. He looked down, his voice barely a whisper. Since Mom died." Michael's throat tightened, his mind racing with questions. He didn't need to ask how Tommy's mother had died. He could see the loss, the pain, in the boy's eyes. Whatever had happened, it had shattered this family in ways that would never fully heal. But that didn't mean Tommy couldn't be saved. Michael was determined to make sure of that. Brian, who had been listening quietly, straightened, his jaw clenched. "We need to get him out of here now," he said, glancing toward the door. "We don't know how much time we have before his father comes back." Michael nodded in agreement, his hand steady on Tommy's shoulder. "Let's get you to the car, Tommy. We're going to take you somewhere safe." The boy hesitated, his wide eyes darting around the room. But then, with a deep breath, he reached out and took Michael's hand, his small fingers clinging tightly to the officer's larger, stronger ones. Together, they stood, and Tommy winced slightly as he put weight on his leg, the bruised skin still tender from the chain. But he didn't complain. He was too scared to do anything but follow Michael and Brian out of the room. As they made their way down the stairs, the house seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The air was thick with the stench of rot and neglect, each creak of the floorboards sounding like a warning. Michael kept a firm grip on Tommy's hand, his senses on high alert, ready to protect the boy from any threat that might emerge. They were almost at the front door when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car engine pulling up outside the house. Brian froze, his eyes widening. "That's him, isn't it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tommy's grip on Michael's hand tightened, his whole body trembling. His voice came out as a choked whisper, filled with terror. "He's back. He's going to be so mad." Michael's mind raced, his heart pounding as he quickly assessed the situation. They didn't have time to make it to the patrol car. They were trapped in the house, and Tommy's father was just outside. Michael glanced around, his gaze landing on a small hallway closet nearby. Without hesitation, he knelt down and looked Tommy in the eyes, his voice urgent but steady. "Tommy, I need you to hide in here, okay? Don't make a sound. No matter what happens. We're going to handle this, but you need to stay hidden." Tommy's eyes filled with fear, but he nodded, trusting Michael completely. Michael opened the closet door, gently guiding Tommy inside. "Stay here and don't move," he whispered. "We'll come back for you." He closed the door softly, the child's face disappearing into the shadows just as the front door creaked open. Michael and Brian exchanged a tense glance, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons as they stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate, each step sending a chill down their spines. The man's presence was almost tangible, a dark, menacing energy that filled the room. Michael gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. The man's voice broke the silence, gruff and laced with malice. "Tommy, where are you hiding, boy?" His tone was low, predatory, filled with a twisted amusement. "Thought you could call the cops on me, huh? You know I don't like snitches." Michael's grip tightened on his weapon, his rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. The man was getting closer, his footsteps echoing through the narrow hallway as he moved toward the stairs. Michael took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just about protecting Tommy anymore. This was about ensuring that this monster would never harm his son or anyone else again. The man's shadow loomed larger as he approached, and Michael's heart pounded in his chest, every nerve on high alert. He knew he had to act quickly and decisively, but he also knew that any misstep could put Tommy in even greater danger. As the man rounded the corner, he stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Michael and Brian standing in the shadows. His face twisted into a sneer, and he chuckled, a dark and menacing sound. Well, he drawled, his tone dripping with contempt. "Looks like the boy called in some backup. You think you're gonna take me down?" Michael stepped forward, his expression cold and unyielding. A father's fury. The man standing before Officer Michael Davis and his partner, Officer Brian Cole, was tall and wiry, with a cruel glint in his eyes that sent a chill through the room. He was unshaven, his clothes rumpled and stained, and his face twisted with a mixture of anger and twisted amusement as he sized up the two officers. The dark energy he projected filled the space, creating a suffocating atmosphere. Michael could feel the fury radiating off him, an uncontained rage that had been simmering for far too long. Well, the man sneered, his voice a low growl, full of contempt and mockery. "Look at this. My son's little cries for help actually brought some guests. Guess he doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut, huh?" Michael's grip on his weapon tightened, and he struggled to keep his anger in check. Everything in him wanted to confront this man, to make him answer for the terror and pain he'd inflicted on his own child. But he knew he had to remain calm and strategic. Any sign of provocation could put young Tommy in even more danger. "Sir," Michael said, his voice steady and professional, though the words burned in his throat, "we received a call from your son. We're here to ensure his safety and well-being. We'll need you to cooperate with us." The man's sneer deepened, and he crossed his arms, leaning against the wall with a casual arrogance that belied the tense atmosphere. My son doesn't know what he's talking about." The boy soughed. "Needs to learn some discipline. That's what I'm doing. Teaching him how to be a man. Maybe if the world wasn't so full of people like you meddling in family business, kids wouldn't grow up so weak." Brian, who had been standing to the side, shifted his stance, his jaw clenched with barely contained anger. He took a step forward, his voice cold and unwavering. "Discipline? You call chaining a child to a bed and leaving him to rot discipline? You're a coward, and we're here to make sure that boy never has to endure your version of discipline again." The man's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as he straightened, squaring his shoulders. "You don't know anything about me or my family," he spat. "That boy is mine, and I'll raise him however I see fit. You think you can just waltz in here and tell me what to do?" Michael took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice level. "Sir, we're here because of a report of abuse. We have a responsibility to investigate and ensure the safety of your child. You need to step aside and allow us to do our job." But the man's gaze flickered with defiance, and his fists clenched. He took a step forward, his eyes filled with a dangerous glint. "Oh, I don't think so. I know how this works. You come in here, you try to play hero, and I end up losing my son. Well, that's not going to happen. I'm not letting you or anyone else take what's mine." The tension in the air was thick, an invisible line drawn between the officers and the man, who seemed ready to fight for control of his twisted version of family. Michael could sense that any wrong move could trigger violence, and he prepared himself mentally, his senses heightened, each muscle tensed in readiness. Michael kept his gaze steady, projecting a calm authority. "We're not here to take anything from you. We're here to protect Tommy, and that's not negotiable. If you cooperate, this can go smoothly, but if you continue to resist, you'll be facing additional charges." The man's eyes flashed with fury, his face contorting into a snarl. "Charges? You think I care about your threats? That boy is mine. You people think you can just barge into my life, into my house, and tell me how to raise my son. He's weak because of people like you, always coddling him, always whispering lies into his head. I'm trying to make a man out of him." Before Michael could respond, the man lunged forward, his hand reaching out toward him in a sudden, violent movement. Instinctively, Michael sidestepped, his hand going to his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon. Not yet. Instead, he raised his arm to block the man's advance, maintaining a defensive posture. "Stand down." Michael's voice was firm, commanding. "Don't make this worse for yourself." The man stopped, breathing heavily, his face twisted with rage. He looked as if he was teetering on the edge of control, his eyes darting between Michael and Brian, weighing his options, deciding whether to fight or flee. Brian took a step forward, his stance tense but controlled. "This is your last warning," he said, his tone cold. "You lay another hand on anyone, and you'll be facing more than just a visit from Child Protective Services." For a brief moment, the man's bravado faltered. He seemed to consider his situation, the weight of the consequences finally sinking in. But then his face hardened, and his lips curled into a defiant sneer. "You're all the same," he muttered. "You come here with your badges and think you're better than me. that you have the right to interfere with my family." The officers stood their ground, silently watching as he wrestled with his rage. But then, as if a switch had flipped, the man straightened, his expression shifting from fury to cold calculation. He took a step back, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You win. Go ahead, take him. He's probably better off with strangers anyway. Weak little coward." The words were meant to sting, and Michael felt a surge of anger on Tommy's behalf, but he refused to let the man see any reaction. Instead, he gave a curt nod, signaling to Brian that they should proceed. Michael motioned toward the front door, gesturing for the man to lead the way. "Step outside," he ordered, his tone calm but unyielding. "We'll handle things from here." The man hesitated, a glimmer of defiance still flickering in his eyes, but eventually he moved toward the door. As he passed by Michael, he leaned in close, his voice a low hiss. "You might be taking him away now, but don't think this is over. You can't protect him forever. I'll get him back, and there's nothing you can do about it." Michael met his gaze, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt a fierce determination. "We'll see about that." Once the man was outside, Brian quickly radioed for backup, explaining the situation in a calm but urgent tone. Michael kept his eyes trained on the man, ensuring he didn't try anything while they waited. He was seething inside, but he knew he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. Tommy's safety was all that mattered now. A few moments later, backup arrived, and 2 additional officers stepped out of their patrol car, their expressions grim as they assessed the situation. Michael and Brian briefed them quickly, and together they ensured the man was secured and taken into custody. As they watched him being led away in handcuffs, Michael felt a grim satisfaction. For now, at least Tommy was safe from his father's reach. Once the man was gone, Michael and Brian returned to the house, their footsteps echoing through the empty, oppressive silence. Michael approached the small closet where he had hidden Tommy, his heart heavy with anticipation. Gently, he knocked on the door. "Tommy, it's Officer Michael," he said softly. "You can come out now." "He's gone." The door opened slowly, and Tommy's small face appeared, his eyes wide and fearful. He looked up at Michael, searching his face for reassurance. "Is he really gone?" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, filled with disbelief. Michael knelt down, his gaze steady and kind. "Yes, Tommy. He's gone. He can't hurt you anymore." The boy's face crumpled, and he threw himself into Michael's arms, clutching at him with desperate relief. Michael held him gently, letting the boy's tears soak into his uniform, his own heart aching with empathy and anger. "It's over, Tommy," he murmured, his voice soft but fierce. "You're safe now. We're going to take care of you." Tommy sobbed quietly, his small body trembling with the release of weeks, maybe even years, of fear and pain. Michael kept his arms around him, offering comfort and protection, silently vowing that he would do everything in his power to help this boy heal. Brian, watching the scene, wiped at his own eyes, overcome by the raw emotion in the room. After a few moments, he knelt beside them, placing a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "We've got you, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not alone anymore." Gradually, Tommy's sobs subsided, and he pulled back, looking at the 2 officers with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. His eyes were red and swollen, his face pale and gaunt, but there was a spark of hope in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Are you going to take me somewhere safe?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Michael nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. "Yes, Tommy. We're taking you somewhere safe, where people will take care of you and make sure you're never hurt again." With that, they led Tommy out of the house, his small hand held firmly in Michael's. As they stepped into the fresh night air, Tommy took a deep breath, as if shedding the dark weight of the home he was leaving behind. For Michael and Brian, this was more than just another call. It was a reminder of why they had chosen this path, why they wore the badge. They knew that there would be more battles ahead, more struggles for Tommy to face, but for now he was safe, and that was enough. In the days to come, they would follow his journey closely, hoping that this powerful act of rescue would be the first step toward healing a young life that had known too much darkness. And as they drove away from the house, they did so with a renewed commitment to protect, to serve, and to bring light to those who needed it most. The road to healing. The days that followed the rescue of Tommy were filled with a mixture of relief and heaviness for Officer Michael Davis and his partner, Officer Brian Cole. They had been through countless cases together, but this one had left a deep mark on both of them. Tommy's innocent eyes, his trembling hands, the fear etched into every movement. All these haunted Michael's thoughts long after he left the police station each night. There was no forgetting the trauma that lingered in the child's gaze, or the quiet desperation with which he had clung to Michael's hand when they had led him out of that house. The process of placing Tommy in a safe environment had been swift. After a medical evaluation at the local hospital, where doctors assessed his bruises, malnutrition, and overall physical condition, social services arranged a temporary foster placement for him. The foster family, the Rileys, had a reputation for compassion and patience. They had taken in other children in need before, and their kindness was well known. Michael and Brian both knew that this would be just a temporary solution, but it was a necessary step for Tommy to find stability and start healing. The night after the rescue, Michael found himself sitting alone in his kitchen, long after his family had gone to bed. A single light illuminated the room, casting shadows across the table as he stared into the depths of his coffee mug, his mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours. The quiet of the house felt heavy, as though even the walls knew the weight he carried. His wife, Sarah, padded softly into the room, her face etched with concern. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when a case had affected him more deeply than usual. Without a word, she poured herself a cup of tea and joined him at the table, her hand reaching out to gently cover his. "Michael," she said softly, her eyes searching his face. "Do you want to talk about it?" Michael hesitated, his gaze fixed on his coffee. I can't get him out of my head, Sarah. That little boy, Tommy, what he went through. It's unimaginable. No child should ever have to live in fear of their own parent." Sarah squeezed his hand, her heart aching for her husband, and for the boy he couldn't stop thinking about. "But you helped him, Michael. You and Brian saved him. You're giving him a chance to find peace, to have a future that's free from fear." Michael nodded, but the guilt lingered, a weight pressing down on him. "I know, but there's so much damage, what he endured. I don't know if he'll ever fully heal from that. We can take him out of that house, but we can't erase the memories, the scars." Sarah looked at him, her expression filled with quiet determination. "Maybe not, but you've given him a chance, and that's more than he had before. Now he has people around him who care, who will protect him. Sometimes, Michael, that's all we can do, give someone a chance." Her words, though simple, offered a comfort that he desperately needed. He squeezed her hand in return, grateful for her steady presence. After a few minutes, he stood up, kissed her on the forehead, and headed to bed, hoping that sleep would bring him some respite. The next day, Michael and Brian visited Tommy at the Rileys' home. They had arranged with social services to check in on him, both to monitor his well-being and to give him a sense of continuity and safety. The house was modest but warm, with a cozy living room filled with toys, books, and family photos. As they approached the front door, Michael felt a pang of hope that maybe this place, even if only temporary, could help Tommy start to feel safe again. Mrs. Riley, a kind woman in her mid-40s with a gentle smile, opened the door and welcomed them in. She was the type of person who exuded warmth and kindness, the kind that could calm even the most restless soul. "Hello, officers," she greeted them, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and compassion. "Tommy's been waiting for you. He talks about you both a lot." Michael smiled, touched by the idea that Tommy had found comfort in their presence. "Thank you, Mrs. Riley. How has he been?" She led them into the living room, where Tommy sat on a small couch, clutching a stuffed bear that looked almost as worn as he did. The sight of the boy made Michael's heart ache all over again. He looked so small, so vulnerable, but there was a faint glimmer of something else in his eyes, a hint of hope, perhaps. "He's adjusting," Mrs. Riley said gently, her gaze soft as she watched Tommy. "It'll take time, of course. He's still very quiet, and he has trouble sleeping. But we're taking things one day at a time." Tommy looked up as they entered, his eyes lighting up with recognition. He clutched the bear tighter, a small smile forming on his lips. "Officer Michael, Officer Brian." Michael knelt down to his level, returning the boy's smile with one of his own. "Hey, Tommy. How are you doing, buddy?" Tommy shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Okay, I guess. Mrs. Riley says I can stay here for a while." His voice was soft, hesitant, as though he still couldn't quite believe it was real. Michael nodded, his voice filled with reassurance. "That's right. Mrs. Riley is going to take care of you, and we'll be checking in on you too. You're not alone anymore, Tommy." Tommy's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "But what if he finds me? What if he comes back?" Brian knelt down beside Michael, his voice gentle but firm. "Tommy, listen to me. Your father can't hurt you anymore. We've made sure of that. You're safe here. We'll make sure no one ever hurts you again." The boy looked at them, his face a mixture of hope and doubt. It was clear that even though he wanted to believe them, the scars of his past were still too raw, too fresh. He had spent so long living in fear that the idea of safety seemed like a distant dream. Michael reached out, placing a comforting hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You've been very brave, Tommy, and I know it's hard to trust right now. But I want you to remember that we're here for you, no matter what." Tommy nodded slowly, his small hand still clutching the bear. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes showed that he was beginning to believe, little by little, that he could indeed be safe. After spending some time with Tommy, talking about his favorite things and sharing small stories to lighten the mood, Michael and Brian prepared to leave. They said their goodbyes, promising to visit again soon. As they walked back to their car, both men were quiet, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Brian spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Do you think he'll be okay, Michael?" Michael took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I don't know, Brian. I really don't. But I do know that he's resilient, and with the right support, with people who care about him, maybe he can start to heal." Brian nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "He's a tough kid, stronger than most. I think he'll be okay, eventually." The days turned into weeks, and Michael and Brian continued to check in on Tommy, building a steady bond with the young boy. Each time they visited, they saw small signs of progress. He began to speak a little more, to smile occasionally, to trust that the people around him weren't there to hurt him. One afternoon, Michael received a call from Mrs. Riley. Her voice was calm, but filled with excitement. "Officer Davis, I thought you'd like to know. Tommy had his first full night of sleep last night. He told me he didn't have any nightmares." Michael's heart swelled with relief and joy. "That's wonderful news, Mrs. Riley. Thank you for letting me know. I can't tell you how much that means." Later that day, he and Brian visited Tommy again. When they arrived, Tommy greeted them with a big smile, the first genuine smile they'd seen from him since the rescue. The bear he'd once clutched so tightly was now resting casually on the couch beside him, no longer a shield against the nightmares that had plagued him. "Hey, Tommy," Michael said, his voice warm. "I heard you had a good night's sleep." Tommy nodded, looking a little bashful. "Yeah, I didn't have any bad dreams." Brian grinned, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's awesome, buddy. You're really brave, you know that." Tommy's smile widened, and he looked down, clearly pleased. For the first time, Michael saw a glimmer of confidence in the boy's eyes, a sign that he was beginning to believe in himself again. Over the following weeks, Michael and Brian continued their visits, becoming a steady presence in Tommy's life. They watched as he grew stronger, as he began to open up and trust again. They knew that the road to healing was long, and that there would be setbacks, but each step forward was a victory. One evening, as they prepared to leave after a visit, Tommy looked up at them, his expression serious. "Officer Michael, Officer Brian, thank you for saving me." Michael knelt down, his eyes soft as he met the boy's gaze. "You saved yourself, Tommy. You were the one brave enough to call for help. We just did our job." Tommy shook his head, his eyes filled with gratitude. "No, you saved me, and I'll never forget that." As they walked back to their car, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that Tommy's journey was far from over, but he also knew that the boy was surrounded by people who cared, people who would walk with him every step of the way. For the first time since the rescue, Michael felt that they had not only saved a life, but given that life a chance to thrive. And for him, for a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, that was everything. Facing the darkness, the progress Tommy was making in his new environment brought a quiet joy to Officer Michael Davis and Officer Brian Cole, who had invested so much of their own hearts into his journey. Yet, as Tommy adjusted to life with the Rayleighs and began to heal, the looming shadow of his father's court case cast a pall over everyone involved. The man had been charged with multiple counts of child abuse, neglect, and unlawful imprisonment. The evidence against him was damning. The chain marks on Tommy's ankle, the testimony of the officers, the squalid conditions of the house. But despite the charges, Tommy's father had pleaded not guilty, claiming that his actions were parenting methods intended to toughen up his son. His lawyer, a slick and unyielding figure, argued that the police had overstepped, that they had interfered in family matters. For Tommy, the news of the court case was terrifying. Although he was safe in the Rayleighs' home, the mere thought of facing his father in court triggered the terror that had once gripped his everyday life. And for Michael, the thought of putting Tommy through such a traumatic experience filled him with a gnawing guilt. He knew the testimony was essential, that Tommy's words could seal his father's fate, but he also feared the damage it could cause to the boy's fragile psyche. As the court date approached, the Rayleighs did everything they could to prepare Tommy. Mrs. Riley sat with him each night, talking about what he might see in the courtroom, trying to help him understand that he would be safe, no matter what. Michael and Brian also visited regularly, reassuring Tommy that they would be there by his side, protecting him from any harm. One evening, a few days before the trial, Michael sat with Tommy in the Rayleighs' living room. Tommy was curled up in his favorite corner of the couch, clutching his stuffed bear tightly. His small frame seemed to shrink as he hugged his knees, his eyes dark with fear. "Officer Michael," Tommy began, his voice barely above a whisper, "do I really have to go to court? Do I have to see him?" Michael's heart ached as he looked at the boy, his own conscience warring with the need for justice. He leaned forward, his voice soft and steady. "Tommy, I know it's scary. I can't imagine how hard this must be for you. But your voice is powerful. If you're able to tell the judge what happened, you can help make sure he can't hurt anyone ever again." Tommy looked down at his bear, his small fingers brushing over its worn fur. "But what if he's mad at me? What if he tries to hurt me again?" Michael placed a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. "He won't, Tommy. I promise you. Your father won't be able to come near you. We're going to be there. The judge will be there. And there will be a lot of people who want to make sure you're safe. You're not alone in this." Tommy nodded, though his eyes still held a shadow of doubt. Michael could see the inner turmoil, the memories he was struggling to keep at bay. It took everything in him to stay calm, to keep his emotions under control, when all he wanted was to shield Tommy from this painful ordeal. On the day of the trial, Michael arrived early at the courthouse. He had dressed in his formal uniform, hoping that the presence of authority would reassure Tommy. Brian arrived shortly after, his expression serious, as they both awaited the arrival of the Rileys and Tommy. When Tommy finally arrived, he looked small and fragile in his formal clothes, his hand gripping Mrs. Riley's with a white-knuckled intensity. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously around the large, intimidating building as they made their way inside. Michael stepped forward, kneeling down to Tommy's level. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, offering him a reassuring smile. "Remember, we're all here for you. We're going to be right by your side the whole time." Tommy nodded, though his lower lip trembled. I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Michael put a hand on his shoulder. "That's okay. It's okay to be scared. You're really brave for coming here today. Just remember, you're safe. No one can hurt you here." They led Tommy through the courthouse, passing by rows of benches and people who had come to witness the trial. Some looked at Tommy with sympathy, others with curiosity, but all eyes were on him. Michael could feel the boy's small hand tighten around his own, as if he were holding on for dear life. They guided him into a private waiting room, where he could sit away from the crowds and gather himself before facing the courtroom. Mrs. Riley sat beside Tommy, holding his hand and whispering soothing words. Michael and Brian stood by the door, giving the family a moment of privacy. But even as he watched the scene, Michael felt his own heart pounding with a mix of anger and sadness. He hated that this young boy had to relive his trauma, hated the twisted irony of forcing him to confront his abuser to secure his future. After a few minutes, a court official entered and announced that it was time for Tommy to testify. The boy's face turned even paler, but he didn't let go of Mrs. Riley's hand as they all walked down the hallway toward the courtroom. Just before they entered, Michael knelt down one last time. "Remember, Tommy," he said, his voice filled with warmth and reassurance, "you're not alone in there. Look at me and Brian if you feel scared. We're here, and we're so proud of you." Tommy took a deep breath, nodding. His eyes shimmered with tears, but he blinked them away, trying to summon the courage he had been holding onto for so long. Together, they stepped into the courtroom. The room was vast and solemn, filled with rows of wooden benches, high ceilings, and stern-faced officials. In the center of it all was the witness stand, a place where countless people had come to tell their truths. Tommy's father was seated at the defendant's table, his face impassive, his eyes cold and distant. Tommy froze when he saw him, and Michael placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, guiding him gently toward the witness stand. With the help of Mrs. Riley, Tommy climbed into the seat, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing structure around him. He clutched his bear, which he'd been allowed to bring for comfort, his hand shaking slightly as he looked around the room. The judge, a kindly-looking man with gray hair and wise eyes, offered Tommy a small smile before speaking. "Tommy, thank you for coming here today. I know this must be very difficult for you, but I want you to know that everyone in this room is here to make sure you're safe. All you need to do is tell us what happened, in your own words. Can you do that?" Tommy glanced at Michael and Brian, who both gave him encouraging nods. He took a deep, shaky breath, then turned back to the judge. My dad, he used to hurt me," he began, his voice trembling. He'd lock me in my room and chain me to the bed so I couldn't leave. He said it was because I was weak, that I needed to learn to be stronger, but it hurt, and I was scared all the time." As he spoke, his father's face remained cold, unfeeling, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as though none of this concerned him. But the people in the courtroom, the jury, the judge, the onlookers, listened intently, their faces filled with shock and sorrow as they heard Tommy's words. Michael clenched his fists at his sides, struggling to keep his composure as he watched this young child recount the horrors he had endured. "Sometimes he'd leave me alone for days," Tommy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't have any food or water. I was so hungry, and sometimes I thought I'd never get out. The court fell silent, the weight of his words settling heavily over everyone in the room. Even the most hardened members of the jury looked moved, their expressions softening as they absorbed the boy's testimony. Mrs. Riley wiped away a tear, holding her hands tightly in her lap as she listened. "Tommy," the prosecutor said gently, stepping forward, "can you tell us about the night you called the police? What made you reach out for help?" Tommy hesitated, his eyes darting toward his father before shifting back to Michael and Brian. Their presence seemed to give him strength, and he spoke in a trembling but determined voice. I couldn't take it anymore. I was so scared, and I didn't know what else to do. I just wanted someone to help me. So when he left the house one night, I found the phone and called the police. I didn't know if anyone would come, but I just wanted it to stop." As Tommy's words filled the room, Michael felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak. This small, fragile boy had endured unimaginable pain, yet he had found the courage to call for help. He had saved himself, reaching out from the depths of his fear and despair to grasp at a sliver of hope. The prosecutor nodded, thanking Tommy for his bravery, and turned back to the judge. The defense attorney, however, rose from his seat, a cold expression on his face as he prepared to cross-examine the boy. "Tommy," the lawyer said, his tone calculated and smooth, "are you sure you're remembering things correctly? Sometimes, when we're young, our memories can play tricks on us. Perhaps your father wasn't actually hurting you. Maybe he was trying to keep you safe, but you misunderstood." Tommy's face twisted with confusion and fear, his gaze darting between the lawyer and Michael. The suggestion that he was somehow wrong, that he hadn't truly experienced the horrors he remembered, seemed to shake him. Michael's hands clenched again, fighting the urge to step forward, to protect Tommy from this verbal assault. But the judge intervened, his voice stern. "Counselor, this is a child, recounting a traumatic experience. I expect you to treat him with the respect and care he deserves." The lawyer cleared his throat, muttering an apology before taking his seat. The moment was brief, but it seemed to restore Tommy's confidence. He looked back at the judge, his small shoulders squared, and spoke with a newfound resolve. "No," he said firmly, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "I remember everything. I remember how it felt, how scared I was. And I remember calling for help because I knew I couldn't do it alone." A ripple of quiet admiration passed through the room, and the judge nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Tommy. You're very brave." The court proceedings continued, but Tommy's testimony had already left an indelible mark. When he was finally excused, he climbed down from the stand and walked back to Michael, his steps slow but steady. He looked up at the officer, his eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and relief. Did I do okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael knelt down, his gaze filled with pride and affection. "You did more than okay, Tommy. You were amazing. You were so brave." Tommy managed a small smile, his hand reaching out to take Michael's. They left the courtroom together, with Mrs. Riley and Brian following close behind, all of them united in their determination to shield Tommy from any further pain. Outside, in the fresh air, Tommy looked up at the sky, his face bathed in sunlight. For the first time, he seemed at peace, as though the weight of his father's shadow had finally begun to lift. The court had yet to deliver its verdict, but they all knew that, regardless of the outcome, Tommy's courage had already won a different kind of justice, the kind that came from facing his fears and speaking his truth. As they drove him back to the Rileys, Michael glanced at Tommy in the rearview mirror, marveling at the resilience of this young boy who had endured so much and had somehow found the strength to rise above it. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and unknowns, but one thing was clear. Tommy had taken the first, hardest steps on his journey toward healing, and as long as he continued to walk that path, he would never have to face it alone. A new beginning. The days following Tommy's testimony were a whirlwind of emotions for everyone involved. The trial had left the young boy drained but resolute, his courage standing as a testament to the strength he had developed over the past months. Officer Michael Davis and Officer Brian Cole had remained close by throughout, visiting him frequently at the Riley's home, sharing quiet moments of comfort and reassurance that became vital to his recovery. They knew that Tommy's journey was far from over, but they also knew he had made an immense stride toward healing. A week after the trial concluded, Michael received the call they had all been waiting for. The verdict was in. Tommy's father had been found guilty on all counts. The court had sentenced him to a lengthy prison term, ensuring that he would be locked away for years. Tommy would never have to face him again. The relief that washed over Michael was profound. He immediately dialed Mrs. Riley to share the news, knowing that Tommy needed to hear it from someone he trusted. She promised to sit down with him that evening and break the news gently. That night, as Michael sat in his living room with his wife and daughter, he found himself staring at his phone, hoping for an update. His wife, Sarah, noticed his distraction and reached over, giving his hand a comforting squeeze. "Are you still thinking about Tommy?" she asked softly. Michael nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "I know he's safe now. I know he's with good people. But I can't help but feel responsible. Like I need to keep checking on him, just to be sure." Sarah smiled, understanding his emotions well. "You've done more than anyone could ever expect, Michael. You've given that boy a chance to rebuild his life. But you also have to let him find his own way now. He's stronger than he looks, you know." Just as she spoke, his phone buzzed, and he saw Mrs. Riley's name on the screen. He answered immediately, his heart pounding. "Mrs. Riley, how's Tommy?" Her voice on the other end was warm and filled with pride. Well, I think he's relieved. I told him the news, and at first, he just sat there, quiet and thoughtful. But after a while, he smiled. A real, honest smile. He even told me he feels like he can finally breathe again." Michael closed his eyes, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Thank you for letting me know. That means everything." "Of course," she replied, a smile evident in her voice. "Actually, he has something he wants to say to you and Officer Cole. If you're free tomorrow, we'd love to have you over." "We'll be there," Michael promised, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The next day, Michael and Brian drove together to the Riley's home, each of them feeling a mixture of excitement and curiosity. It was a beautiful autumn morning, the air crisp and clear, with leaves painting the streets in hues of red, orange, and yellow. As they arrived, Mrs. Riley met them at the door, greeting them with a warm smile. "Tommy's been waiting for you," she said, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and affection. They followed her into the living room, where Tommy sat on the couch, clutching his bear as always, but with a newfound brightness in his eyes. He looked up as they entered, his face lighting up with a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile they had never seen before. "Hi, Officer Michael." "Hi, Officer Brian," he said, his voice steady and clear. Michael knelt down beside him, smiling back. "Hey, Tommy. How are you feeling?" Tommy took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "I feel free," he said softly, a sense of wonder in his voice, as if he were still trying to comprehend what that word truly meant. Brian, standing beside Michael, nodded. "That's a big word, Tommy, but it sounds like you've earned it." Tommy nodded, his fingers brushing over the worn fur of his bear. He looked at them both, his expression serious. "I wanted to thank you. You saved me. If you hadn't come, I don't know where I'd be. But now I feel like I can be someone new." For the first time since this journey had begun, Michael felt a profound sense of closure. Tommy was safe, he was healing, and he had a chance to build a life filled with love and purpose. In a world that so often seemed filled with darkness, they had been able to bring a little light into one child's life. And for Michael, that was everything. As they drove into the fading light of the autumn evening, Both officers knew that they would carry Tommy's story with them forever, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of hope.